Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word. Our scripture reading this morning is two selections from the letter of James. First is from chapter 1, verse 12 through 18. Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. Such a one has stood the test and will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. No one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then what that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved. Every generous act of giving, with every perfect gift, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Our second scripture reading comes to us from the 5th chapter, verse 7 through 11. Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crops from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. As an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Indeed, we can call blessed those who showed endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. This is the word of God for you and me, the people of God. Thanks be to God. When I met my wife, Linda, she had a black lab, Vivian. Vivi was a smart dog. You could tell her or show her what you wanted to do, usually just once, and she would pick up right away what it was. Smart dog. I've had other smart dogs in my life, but the dog we have now, Yogi, he is not one of them. And this isn't, you have those dogs who are smart, but they're just sort of ornery or stubborn. They just don't want to do what you want them to do. That's not him. He's just dumb. And to make it worse, he's part terrier or maybe part beagle. We're not sure exactly what he is. And so he likes to get his nose going. If he gets a shot, he'll go out and just follow his nose and run and run and run until he gets caught by the dog police and ends up in doggy jail. Now, if he was human, or perhaps maybe a little bit smarter, he would probably try to come up with some rationalization for why he does what he does, as well as why he ends up in doggy prison. Perhaps he might try to blame the devil. The devil made me do it. No personal culpability involved there. Everyone else is responsible except for him as the person who left the door open and the person who left the spot in the fence that he was able to squeeze through. He might even argue that the temptation was put there because he's so strong and so powerful in order to try and bring him down. That he's so great is the reason why that place was put for him to try and run. Or he might try to say, as we hear often, that it was God who tried to tempt him. Maybe it was even God who pushed him out the door and caused him to run, and God caused him to end up in doggy prison, but God's been with him through the entire thing. But regardless of which excuse is used, of temptation and suffering that he undergoes through, all of them also take patience, more on my end so that I don't just try to kill the dog when he ends up in doggy prison. But what James tells us in those passages we just heard is that our typical understanding of temptation and suffering and impatience really are wrong. We don't understand what's actually going on. Now, suffering is universal. It's not that one person suffers and another person doesn't.
We all suffer, although we all suffer in different ways. Temptation, too, is universal. Even the most perfect people in the world are tempted by something and they fall into that. But patience, I'm not sure, is actually universal. I remember being in a restaurant called Ed DeBevick's. Some of you might remember. It was a 50s themed restaurant, sort of known for rude and surly waiters and waitresses, and their motto, which was eat and get out. And the table next to us had asked their waitress for something. She said, "Patience is a virtue. Now hurry up and get some." We say that patience is a virtue, but is patience actually a virtue? James might even say patience is a virtue, but I'm not totally convinced. If you dialed 911 and asked for the paramedics or the fire department or the police department, and the dispatcher said they'll get there when they get you, have some patience. I'm not sure that would be very virtuous. There are times when we need something immediately, and we don't have the patience to wait for them to get there. Likewise, if I was to have been preaching for an hour and said, I'll be done in 10 more minutes, have a little patience, you might not have as much patience as I would like you to have. There are times when we need something immediately, like the police, and there's sometimes when we want something to end immediately just because we're tired of it going on. Those are different things and require different types of patience. I think that's when we go to the doctor. The reason they call us patients is so that we're reminded when we're sitting there waiting for somebody to do something for us that we need to exhibit a little bit of patience. But James is not really talking about that first sort of immediate patience, the ones when we dial 911 of needing something immediately. He's more concerned with that second type where we want things to happen immediately, but they take a while and we have to wait for them. The example he gives is of the farmer who has to sit and wait. First, they have to wait for that early rain, which they need in order to prepare their fields, the moisture to give their seeds enough to start growing. Then they need that later rain in order to keep the crops still growing. The one he leaves off is then they have to wait for the rains to stop so that they can bring in their harvest. And if any of those things go wrong, they're at risk for losing it all. Our last church was in a small farming community, and except for those who actually had irrigation, most of the farmers that we lived around were dryland wheat farmers. They're dependent upon that rain, which wasn't coming because of the droughts. And so in the 2 years we were there, they didn't take in a single crop. They should have had 3 at least a year, if 4 in good years. So they might get 4 this year with the rain they've gotten. They didn't take in a single crop in the 2 years we were there, and they hadn't taken in crops before we arrived. That takes patience to figure out what's going on there. And in a different time, if your crops didn't come in, there would have been considerable suffering as a result as well, which is really where James's idea of patience comes into play, is about suffering. He references the story of Job and the suffering he undergoes and his patience. He actually says endurance. But we talk about the patience of Job. Somebody has the patience of Job, which means in the midst of everything, they're just sort of present and waiting it out. Although we might argue that Job's patience at a point comes to an end, but his suffering also comes to an end, and that's part of the point that James is making as well. So we might say that in having to wait a half hour for our pizza to be delivered to the house, that we are suffering and we have neither the patience for that, but that's neither patience nor suffering. Because some suffering is uniquely different, although it's hard to explain. Trying to think this week of what would be a good definition of what suffering is. Because as I was preparing, I saw this quote from somebody that said that everyone experiences pain, but that suffering is optional. And I thought, no, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that we get to choose whether we're suffering or not. There is a difference between pain and suffering, But it's not like we say, well, if I could choose, I'm not going to do that. And anybody who's actually suffering, it's only because they chose to undergo that. I just can't abide that that's the correct place to be. We might arguing that sometimes people's suffering goes on for too long, and we've probably known people who that suffering becomes a part of who they are, and it's sort of, I don't want to say they revel in it, but they can't separate themselves from that suffering, and so it does continue longer than it might. But I don't think that we could say that if we suffered in our lives, it's because we chose to suffer, that we could have chosen another life in which that was never part of it. And I think that the flip side of that shows us, and that is the word compassion. That's what Jesus says. He has compassion for the people, which literally means to suffer with. So if we say that there's compassion in the world, that means that there has to be suffering in the world for the compassion to be reacting to. And as hard as it is to believe, especially when they're undergoing pain and suffering, they actually make us stronger. I might even argue that they make us better. Not that we would choose that in the moment or even choose that going into it. If we had another choice, we'd say, yeah, I would have rather mixed that and been less of a person than to have gone through that. But on the other side, we can see how we've been strengthened. And the inability to experience those things is actually extremely dangerous. There's a very rare disease known as congenital insensitivity to pain, which we might think, oh, it'd be great not to feel any pain, but it's actually a life-threatening illness. Because pain tells us that we're in danger, that we need to stop whatever it is that we're doing, that we've injured ourselves, that we need to seek assistance, that we need to step aside from what's going on. So we don't often think of pain as being something beneficial or making us safe and making us alive. But in fact, it turns out that that's one of the things that pain does. Now, if I was to ask you, if I could give you the power to give somebody a gift, and that gift would give them moments of pleasure, moments of bliss, moments of joy, but it would also give them pain and suffering and lead to their death. If you had the power to give that gift to somebody, would you do it? That you could give them pleasure and joy, but also pain and suffering and death. By the shaking of the heads, I think most people say, no, we wouldn't do that even to our worst enemies. And yet, that gift is given every single day. If you've had children, you've given that gift. It's called the gift of life. It brings moments of pleasure and joy, but there's also pain and suffering, and we all die. I always love it when there's something in the news and they say, people who did this were 2 times more likely to die. It's like, I thought the death rate was 100%. I'm not sure how that works, that they were 2 times more likely to die than everybody else. We are given the gift of life. We give the gift of life. And it's something that we revel in those moments of joy and pain and bliss, but we also have the pain and the suffering that goes along with it. But we don't look at life as that death sentence. We look at it as this beautiful thing, that gift of hope, whenever a new life is brought into the world. And so James is trying to grapple with all these questions, and in particular what he's trying to grapple with is people who say that all the good things in life come from God, those joyful moments, but all the bad moments in our life also come from God, the pain and the suffering and the temptation. And James says that's not the case, and every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above. And that comes immediately after he says that God does not tempt us. And the way I see that statement from James, that every generous and perfect gift comes from above, and he doesn't say this, but I sort of interpret it to mean that means that every bad and imperfect gift does not come from God. That it comes from somewhere else, that suffering and temptation are not given to us by God. And as I said, that stands in stark contrast to what we often hear about how the world operates. In fact, it stands in contrast to what we say every single week. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Lead me not into temptation." So aren't we asking God not to tempt us? That's how we normally look at that line. But James says that's not the case. The temptation does not come from God. We do it all by ourselves. It's our own desires that lead us down the path of destruction. So when Yogi sees that opening and he starts running, it's not me, it's not the girls, it's not God who's caused him to do that. It's him. I'd say it's his own stupidity, but there's something else in there as well. So we can't blame everybody else as a result of his actions. He has to take responsibility for that path that he's chosen. Now, one possible explanation of saying, "Lord, lead me not into temptation," is a matter of punctuation. And there is no punctuation in Greek, which is what all the New Testament is written in. So when they're translating out of the Greek into the English, translators have to figure out where they might put the punctuation in, where it should properly belong. So as an example, Ephesians 4:28, sort of a paraphrase, Paul says, "Let him that stole steal no more. Let him labor with his hands." Well, we can change that punctuation. Go ahead and put the next one up, Al. "Let him that stole steal. No more let him labor with his hands." It's exactly the same words. We just chose to put our punctuation in differently. But the meaning is radically different than the first one. So rather than saying, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," perhaps it should say, "Lead us, comma, not into temptation, comma, but deliver us from evil." So we're asking God, lead us, deliver us from evil, because by our own inclinations, we're going to go down that path of temptation. That's where we want to go by human nature. So lead us and deliver us not to temptation. That comma separates what we want to do versus what we're asking God to do for us. So what James says is that we give in to the temptations. It's our own natural desires, our own natural inclination to go down that path. And he says that desire gives birth to sin, and that sin, when fully grown, gives birth to death. Or as Paul says, the wages of sin are death. But what saves us from all of that, of course, is Christ. And that's where patience comes back into play. First, because if we practice patience, then we're less likely to fall into temptation. I don't even want to say that we're led into temptation, because again, that puts the onus on somebody else who's sort of pulling us in that direction. James says, no, we go into the temptation quite well all by ourselves. We don't need to blame anybody else. And in finance, there's a rule that says on major expenditures, sometimes on smaller ones, that you should wait at least 24 hours from the time you decided you want it to the time you actually pay for it. To sort of get, is this something I need or is it something I want? Gets rid of sort of those impulse buys, especially major impulse buys. You see that car and oh, I want that. Wait 24 hours and see where you are when your rationality has come back into play. At least hopefully it's come back into play. And it might be that 24 hours later you still say, yeah, that's okay. But often when you wait 24 hours, you say, man, that would have been a really stupid decision for me to make. And so I think that we need to practice that same sort of patience with the temptations that come our way. Because not to say that there aren't some temptations that we've thought about for a long time, over days or months or years, that we give into. That certainly happens, but most of our temptations that we give into are those impulse things. We're at the grocery store and we see that candy bar and we think, ooh, that'd be really good right now. I could use that. Now, maybe 24 hours later isn't a great thing with waiting for a candy bar, but that's how the temptations sort of flare themselves up. And if we said, no, I'm going to take a step back and I'm not going to give in to that temptation at the moment, it'll keep us out of some of the trouble that we end up into. So we are called to show patience in the face of temptation, and to show patience in the face of suffering, and to show patience in waiting for Christ. That's actually the example that James gives of the farmer, is to show patience for waiting for the coming of Christ the way the farmer waits for the coming of the crops. Because what we all know is that temptation and suffering will all run their course. Either they'll disappear of their own accord, or we'll pass on to our eternal reward, and that will end them. And we might not want to hear that, but it's true. But what makes Christianity different from other major religions is that in the face of temptation, in the face of suffering, we offer a different answer to it than anybody else does. Every other major religion recognizes the universality of suffering. All of them have some answer to that. But usually that answer is in the form of some philosophical answer. So in Buddhism, in the Fourfold Truths, says that all suffering comes as a result of our desires. And so we therefore have to overcome our desires and to separate ourselves from everyone and everything in order to put them aside, to alleviate suffering. So we start with a philosophical proposition, and it leads into some action, but really it starts with the understanding that everything is suffering. And so how do we separate ourselves from that? Now, I'm an academic by nature, and so philosophical answers are great for me. Give me something I can chew on and think about and sort of debate in my head, and I'm in a pretty good place. But then we have to say, okay, so how do I apply that to my life? What does that actually look like? And I don't think that saying we're going to separate ourselves from everyone, including our family and everything, is the right answer in the face of suffering. It works for millions of Buddhists. I'm not trying to say they're wrong. I'm just saying that doesn't work for me. But what Christianity offers is not just philosophical truths. We have philosophical truths. But what we offer that's different than every other religion in the world is we offer a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And that makes us fundamentally different in our belief. We offer somebody who has dealt with temptation and overcome it. We offer somebody who has suffered and saw suffering. Indeed, the word excruciating, when we talk about excruciating pain, the word literally means X, out of. Crucio, the cross. Excruciating is out of the cross. We offer someone who saw and experienced suffering, who saw and experienced death. We offer somebody like us, who can bring us into right relationship with God and with each other. Not because he just told us what to do and gave us some philosophical truths about the world, although he did, but because he showed us what to do. He lived out his faith. He lived out God's love. He put his rubber to the road. He didn't just teach these things, he lived it out. And James, the brother of Christ, saw this, saw how Jesus lived it out, and sought to pass that on to us through his letter of offering us Christ. Now, what we've been talking about in James is that aspect of a faith lived out. And what I often struggle with when I'm writing, as I said, I'm an academic, I like to be in my head. Okay, I can give you all the background in this. How do we apply it to what we do every single day? How do we make it applicable? And how does that look like in that passage we heard from James today? Because I don't think saying to be a devoted father, you're gonna be tempted, but it doesn't come from God, and you're gonna know that you're gonna have to suffer, and make sure you're patient through it all. I don't think anybody is going to accept that as a good answer for how we're to live our lives. So instead, here's a different take. The truth is, we're human. and that means we are going to suffer. And we're going to be tempted, and we're going to fail. We say that as Methodists we're moving on to perfection. Nobody here has made a claim that you're perfect, that your heart is so full of the love of God that you no longer give in to temptation. So I think that you, along with me, are going to fail when those temptations come our way. But here is what we see in the midst of all of that as well. That God is present for us. That Christ is present for us. Because what sets us apart in our answer to the issues of temptation and suffering is not some philosophical statement that we make about the nature of the world or the nature of humanity. What sets us apart is the person of Christ, who came because God so loved the world, that God wanted to be reconciled with us. And suffering is not redemptive. We often hear that. Now, God can bring something good out of our suffering. God can redeem the suffering that we go to, but God does not cause the suffering in order to get us to the other side, to teach us some lesson, to make us better people. God can redeem it, but suffering in and of itself is not redeeming. And so we have to know that suffering has an end. To know that temptation and failing and suffering are not the final answer. That God has the final answer. That God writes the final word. And to know that through it all, that God is going to be with us. That Christ, who witnessed and went through the same things that we did, is with us in this journey of faith. That the result of sin is death, but the result of Christ is life, and life abundantly. And that every generous and perfect gift comes to us from God, and that in fulfillment of God's own purposes, God gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits for all of creation. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters. Amen.